Hello, Keith. Welcome to this conversation, which I hope will be really interesting for other people to hear about leading learning in education. So, really great to have you with me.
Morning, Joe.
Splendid. So let's do a little bit of introduction then. So my name's Joanne Miles, and I'm a teacher and a trainer and a consultant in the education sector. I'm also a coach in some organisations as well, and I've been working freelance for about the last 15 years. And we've come to work together over the last year around leading learning. And I was interested to bring you to this forum really to talk about that work and to share some insights with others. So do you want to do a little bit of introduction for yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. So I'm Keith Turner. I'm the Deputy Principal responsible for curriculum quality and inclusion at North Hertfordshire College. I've been in further education for nearly 30 years, and probably about 20 of those in senior leadership roles, mainly focused on curriculum and quality.
Great. So this should be a really fascinating conversation about a very hot topic. First question then to discuss, and I know you've put some notes for us on the screen, which is really going to be useful for people to see. Why do you think we really need to focus on leading learning in further education at the moment? So for you, you've made this first point that you feel learning's come a little bit lost, this notion of learning, within the range of competing priorities that we have. Do you want to say a bit more about that feeling of almost living in a blizzard that I think we all are at the moment?
I think that's a really good way of putting it, actually. So I've been at North Hertfordshire College for about a year, and one of the things that was very noticeable to me when I first started here, and I'm sure this is probably the case across other colleges in the sector as well, is that we had started to lose that kind of core focus, if you like, on teaching and learning, and that's very understandable in the sense that there's so many different competing demands. And certainly when I started to work with my directors and my heads, it was very clear that teaching and learning had been to some extent um, it started to sort of move towards the bottom of the list, if you like, in terms of priorities. We weren't spending enough time on really developing teaching and learning. And we were talking about, making sure that our curriculum was inclusive and making sure that, we're training people for employment and things like all of those things that are essential, but we weren't really focusing sufficiently on what is happening in curriculum areas, how are we developing teaching and learning, how can we prioritize that to actually then better enable us to achieve all of those other things that we know we want to achieve, and I've put those in the bullet points there, ensuring that actually education is doing what education needs to do, which is create opportunities for students.
It's so interesting. I feel I can really echo so many things that you're saying. What I see across the sector in all the work I'm doing around leading learning is that particularly these middle leadership roles, have kind of become very operational, very much
Yes.
about getting students into rooms, creating reports about data, the kind of operational management of the team,
Yeah.
which is demanding because there's a lot to do. Teams have become bigger and bigger, structures have become sleeker and sleeker, if you like, as we've been cut in the sector financially. And as that's happened, as you rightly said, I think the focus around what's happening in classrooms, how are we improving teaching and learning, how are we sharing practice, how are we problem solving together as teachers, has got lost in amongst all of those other things. So for you, why do we really feel that it's so important to put that focus back into the centre? For you, what's the gain going to be if we get the managers and the teachers to focus in that way?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think first and foremost, actually, I think it's that actually middle managers and senior managers to a large extent, I hope would enjoy their jobs a lot more, actually, because I think that, most of the time our motivation for coming into the sector has been very much around that teaching and learning and the desire to, deliver the best that we can to ensure that students do have those opportunities. So I think that's a really important thing. I mean, I think probably also it's it is ultimately our core mission. It is what we're here to do, and I guess that has become lost to some extent. And that, like I said, I think that was very noticeable when I first started here at North Hertfordshire. So I was keen to do that because, we talk about again some of those bullet points that I've mentioned about equipping students with the skills they need, or making sure that actually we're tailoring a curriculum to meet the needs of students, and all of those things we talk about. And of course, we have things like accountability plans and things like that now that we are responsible for. So it stands to reason that actually, to achieve those things, to be successful in our mission, we obviously need to focus on those core things, of which teaching and learning is what we're here to do. I think the only other thing I would probably add, Joe, as well, to this particular slide, is I think the other thing that had occurred to me, and I suppose it is part of um, maybe a priority that had been lost as well, is that notion around quality improvement as well. I think that one of the things that was a bit of a standout for me was a lot of curriculum areas had remained sort of fairly static. So a lot of their self-assessment grades had been pretty much the same, really, for maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 years. And so therefore, it was about trying to put teaching and learning back into the center of things, but actually to also ensure that we were creating that kind of culture as well, that desire to want to improve, that desire to move things forward, that desire to get better. Now, I mean, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do with all of those competing demands, but the quality improvement plans were a major focus for us, as was obviously aspects around that teaching and learning as well.
So many great points there, I think. And for me, there's something in here about getting back to the soul of what we do
Mm.
and really driving everything from the position that we're learning organisations focused on learning, wanting to do a better job for students, wanting to develop staff so that they have a rich, interesting professional
Absolutely.
journey as well. And almost, if we don't put the focus on the teaching and learning and start those conversations and prioritise that, how are we going to be able to create that energy, galvanize people to take action, create the momentum and the culture that you're speaking about? So almost for me, putting the focus on the teaching and learning more actively helps us drive a lot of the activity, a lot of the thinking and the conversations that will drive the useful improvement. It's like a virtuous circle.
Absolutely. Yes, it is indeed. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's carry on and think a little bit more about some other aspects. So you've had a wide-ranging role, you've worked in lots of different organizations. So thinking about your career in the big picture, maybe, what do you feel is really involved in leading learning? What kind of aspects of mindset, of behavior, of activity help you to really put that focus?
I think, certainly in my experience, I think actually being in the role I am, I am that kind of role model, if you like. And so actually, using that opportunity of being a deputy principal to drive that change, I think is absolutely essential. It's not going to it's not just going to come about through chance, through a large number of middle managers, if I'm not the one who's driving that. So I suppose what makes that really important is my enthusiasm and my focus on those things, because that ultimately, and I've said that in the second bullet point, actually articulating a vision, and I've done that pretty much since I arrived here at North Hertfordshire College, around teaching and learning, and making sure that we are investing in it. We're investing in our staff. We're making sure that it's the main focus of our conversation. We run a number of CPD days, for example. We've made sure that actually they are very heavily focused on continuing to develop the teaching and learning and things like that. So, I guess going back to your question, the big picture is that actually it has to be driven from the top to a
Yeah.
large extent, and supported and facilitated. Um, but actually, I do see that as being a real kind of privilege as well, in the sense that the middle managers here have really risen to that
Yeah.
challenge, and that's been lovely. I've not done a huge amount apart from use my role to really drive that focus, but they've done all the work, and that's been really great, actually.
So many interesting things there. I think that there's been a report a little while ago, a couple of years ago, about prioritising the leadership of teaching and learning run by Fettel, Professor Matt O'Leary and colleagues involved. And one of the
Sure.
concepts they come up with is called structured autonomy. And it talks about the fact that senior leaders and middle leaders need to create and organise and protect spaces in which interesting and useful conversations can happen about teaching and learning, but then liberate the staff to have them. That's the
Yes.
autonomy part of it. And I
Yes.
kind of feel that some of the things that I've watched you doing with your colleagues at the college have been about putting the focus in those meetings, bringing it up the agenda, and then making sure that the quality of the conversation is really reflective, is really creative, is really positive and solution focused. So for me, there's something about making sure you're thinking about these things, but there's also the link of talking about them and then creating spaces within operational life to make sure that's possible, right? So for me, it's a real blend of those different things going on.
Sure.
So for you, what are some of the ways that you've been doing it in behaviors or in activities? What kinds of things do you think you're doing in everyday life that help you to do that?
Gosh, I think just going back on what you've just said, I mean, I think one of the challenges in what you just said, Joe, is that actually trying to carve out that time is difficult and has
Yeah.
been difficult. And I think we're in the very early stages um, of doing that at the moment. I mean, we I think probably before we even started on the leading learning, one of the things I changed almost immediately was the way in which we ran meetings. So when I started, a lot of meetings that were being run with our middle management team were very, very operational. I mean, they were sort of instructional in that, you know, it would be very much right now you need to do this on this particular system, or now you need to complete that. So we started really by encouraging some of the managers to bring along examples of what was happening in their curriculum area. And that it became much more structured after that very early starting point, to the extent that actually in every meeting now that we have, there is a presentation usually by one of the middle managers on some of what they're doing, some of what's worked, some of what hasn't worked. Sometimes, and we're just about to start a new series which we're calling called hard nuts to crack,
Mm.
where people are sharing some of those challenges that they're having at the moment in their curriculum area. And so actually all of the other heads and the directors then contribute to what the potential strategy or the solution might be for those. So um, you know, it's really about just trying to carve out that space to facilitate those conversations and to create sort of structures like the one I've just used, an example around meetings, for example, where there is that opportunity to share, there is that opportunity to learn actually from one another. There is the opportunity to solve some of the problems, because actually what I think a lot of the time the heads, my heads in particular, want, partly because they're so stretched, is really good practical solutions.
Yeah.
And you know, I know it may sound sort of slightly daft, but none of that was happening. They weren't talking to one another. They were
Yes.
tending to work in silos. There wasn't any real discussion around teaching and learning and something they might have discovered perhaps through a learning walk, or um, something they'd had a particular issue around, or something they'd been really successful with, maybe in their quality improvement plan and things like that. So it's been about structuring meetings. It's also been about you know, making sure that our CPD is focused around things like, for example, you know, how do you ensure that your quality improvement plan is having the impact that you want? How do you use your quality improvement plan across your team? That's another thing that wasn't really happening. Quality improvement plans were held by the heads,
Mm.
never to be shared.
Mm.
Whereas now the heads and the directors will share that. Everyone is contributing to those things around the quality improvement plan. So there's been a number of kind of vehicles, if you like, for us putting into practice some of that leading learning, um, which actually has changed the institution quite considerably, I would say. It really has made quite a tremendous impact.
It's fascinating to me that it's really about the culture creation, isn't it? It's about
Yeah.
the atmosphere that you create, the way of communicating, the things that you talk about and work on. And underneath that, we've got a lot of points from what you just said, I think, about trying to get open, honest sharing, trying to make sure it's reflective in tone, but that it's also very future focused, thinking
Yeah.
about potential solutions, potential alternative ways of doing things. So to me, there are lots of things there about the focus of the conversation and the language skills that you're using, and also collaboratively bringing people together into forums where those conversations can take place. It's fascinating to me also that middle curriculum leadership group, heads of area, curriculum managers, program leaders, often when I'm working in colleges, do not have an operational meeting where they meet together
Yeah.
frequently as a group to think about their leadership
No,
and their improvement
absolutely.
work. It's a strange operational structural gap in many institutions. And in
Yeah.
fact, just putting that meeting in and making sure it is focused on honest sharing, bringing content that was practical for them makes an immense difference to what people are thinking about, talking about, and therefore acting on.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, Joe, to be completely honest, it is actually been very straightforward to do as
Yes, it's
well.
not complicated to do, is it, that
No,
one?
it's not. It's not because that meeting existed, which is great. It wasn't really, like I said earlier, it wasn't really about sharing anything or working together as a team. But actually, it's been incredibly easy to do, and it's been very well received. My concern was that as soon as I sort of would nominate two people to come along and do a presentation, and they're very short presentations, by the way, on what's happening in terms of their curriculum area and how they're applying things like the leading learning. My fear was that it might not it
Yeah.
might not generate a huge amount of interest. It might just be seen as another sort of process that's been implemented, perhaps. But actually, it's been incredibly well received. To the extent now that uh, they share regardless of that meeting. They're visiting each other's curriculum areas. They've visited each other's meetings. They're going into classes that they wouldn't have otherwise have gone in, perhaps English and maths, for example. So that those silos, if you like, that existed. Um, have broken down quite considerably. More work to do. There's certainly a lot more to do, but it didn't take a huge amount to sort of instigate that, if you like, in terms of that dialogue and the sharing and the working together.
Yeah. I think if people can see the practical applications and the benefits,
Absolutely,
they'll often operate really well in those spaces. But it is
yes,
about kind of stepping up and leading that culture shift, if you like.
it is.
So let's unpick that a little bit more in terms of mindset, skills, and approaches that have helped you really with leading learning in different ways. I think I'm interested in this notion of driving actions to maximize impact, because I feel that you're a kind of person for me in my work who really is very focused on making things happen. So can you say a little bit about how you actually lead in that way?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, I think it's probably very much a kind of characteristic of me as a deputy principal, and probably has been it throughout most of my management roles. I'm I suppose I'm very action focused in the sense that I'm also very impact focused as well. I got a number of years of experience of working in colleges and supporting colleges that perhaps have been struggling, and and sometimes with quite limited time in which to do that. So I guess that's where I've learned that skill of identifying what is it that needs to be done, what are the actions that we then need to apply to try and resolve those. And so often, as we know, it's more complex than just one or two kind of actions. It's quite often about the culture of an organization or culture of a team or whatever, and then making sure that we've got a very clear kind of focus on what we're expecting the outcome to be. So I've driven quality improvement plans for grade three colleges, for example, that maybe have only got a relatively short period of time before a next inspection. So, you know, I, I've kind of brought that to North Herts really, and hence my focus on. Um, I'm a passionate believer in the quality improvement plan and what that can do if it's done well, and how that can bring about change. Um, and if I'm honest, sometimes in further education we don't always do that particularly well. Um, I think sometimes we put documents together and we talk about the strategy and things like that, but sometimes it doesn't perhaps go any further than that. So I tend to work with my teams on very much that approach, that we are driving actions, that we are creating a clear plan, and that actually we want to see exactly what that impact is throughout. In fact, funny enough, yesterday I was having a conversation with my head of quality about this. And one of the things that the college tends not to do is when we get to, I don't know, perhaps about May, June time, the quality improvement plan for that year is sort of forgotten about to some extent because you're getting towards the end of the academic year. What we decided yesterday was that in September we would have the heads present their quality improvement plan, but without all of the in-between bit. So in other words, so that you would only now see the action and the impact, because
Mm.
what I'm hoping it does is it helps support the heads to see very clearly about how effective those actions were in creating that impact. We're very good at filling in boxes and putting in lots of actions, never really quite sure whether they're going to bring about the change that we want to see. Um, but I guess what I'm trying to do is to sort of strip it back for the heads to say, you know, that action that you identified way back in September, this is now the impact of that, or this is not now the impact of that because the action wasn't quite right in the first place. So that's what I'm trying to do with the team at the moment, because those, I can certainly drive actions, but I need the team to drive actions first and foremost, because that's what's going to bring about that change. So those grade twos. Sorry, Joe, the lights keep going out. Those grade two, those grade two areas um, that have been grade two areas for 5 years. We're only going to move them on if we are actually driving those actions and ensuring that we're getting the impact that we want out of those quality improvement plans.
And part of it there, I think, is that empowerment of those middle leaders to be creative and innovative and risk taking in
Absolutely.
thinking about what the actions have been. Fascinating for me that you were the first college to say to me, we want to do some work on the QIP and quality improvement planning. We want to look at some of the skills involved in crafting the
Yes.
actions and in
Yeah.
driving the implementation. And subsequent to that, I've just realized working in loads of places around leading learning that this is actually a really big deal. And in fact, is an area that lots
Yes.
of colleges, I think, can benefit from support with. For those middle leaders, crafting those actions so that they're really well focused, that they're really precise, and that they're chunked down across time effectively, I think is really a difficult skill to learn. And then how
Yes.
they galvanize the team to do the collaborative work around the innovation and the risk taking and looking then at the impact on the students. So to me, there are actually quite a lot of skills there that people need to develop. So QUIP is a
Absolutely.
big part of this, isn't it? The QUIP skill set is really important here.
I've always felt myself that the clip is probably one of the most important things that we
Mm,
do. And yes, you're absolutely right. It involves a whole raft of different skills, and that's hard,
yeah.
to really get to the root cause of issues or areas that you want to improve, to work out what the actions are going to be is a hard thing to do, let alone then to monitor the impact of that. So we've got a renewed focus on the quality improvement plan through our what we call our performance boards, which happen roughly every 6 to 8 weeks. And we test them. I mean, we test them quite hard as well. In that, we want to know that those actions are going to bring about change, and that's been incredibly useful, I think, for the heads, because it's essential. We can't, if we want to improve as a college, that's the driver. That's what's going to happen. That's going to be what needs to happen. Um, and just going back to empowering managers. What's been really nice about this is that um, most of the heads now actually are using their quality improvement plan with their entire team.
Yeah.
And if you like, almost sort of carving it up or testing it with the team, or giving individuals responsibilities for parts of the quality improvement plan, so they're all working together. I mean, again, it's so basic, but they're all working together. They know what the agenda is, they know what the focus is, they know what they need to do. They then report back together as a team on progress with some of those things. So that's been lovely to see, because again, that's not me, that's the managers understanding just how important those documents are, um, but making sure that they're actually using the skill set of the entire team to both develop them and implement them as well. So yeah, I think quality improvement plan absolutely critical in my view, for every sort of level of the organisation.
It's like the bedrock of the work, really, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
So we started some work, as I just mentioned, we started with the QUIP in the summer of last year, and we're now in March. So we've been doing kind of 8 months, 9 months of work.
Yep.
What were your aims really when you started that work? Just give me a feeling for maybe a couple of the top priorities for you. We can see on the screen, we've got lots of points to think about, but the things that really drew you to start to think, we need to do some development and we want to make some change here. What was that coming out of?
Well, I think I mean, it actually just goes back to the quality improvement plan. I think the first, because I think this was last summer, so this was when I was starting to do quite a lot of work with my teams on that quality improvement plan. So I think that's where it kind of grew out of. But I think probably, I realised that it wasn't just going to be about the quality improvement plan, because at the end of the day, you also need to change and build a kind of culture around the quality improvement plan. And so, you know, refocusing people back on things like the teaching and learning, making sure that there was a kind of refocus on that, and that we were carving out the time for people to be able to do that. So I think it was those two elements more than anything else, the quality improvement plan and teaching and learning. But I guess what's kind of struck me is how many things, how many additional things have kind of fallen out of that. So I've said here in the bullet points that actually the managers are different people now. The managers are focused in a different way. I mean, again, I think we're on a journey, to use a cliche. I
Yeah.
think that there is still a huge amount of stuff that is continuously demanded of middle managers, but I like to think there is this sort of shift, and that the managers themselves have started to realise that actually using some of the training that you've delivered for us to then subsequently develop that teaching and learning, and develop that culture, can only lead to, I think, staff who feel that they're a bit more invested in, that there's a bit more of a clearer focus, which right at the beginning of this conversation, I said the reason we went into education was ultimately to deliver teaching and learning and give students opportunities. Well, that's back on the agenda, and that's become a real, um, I think that's become certainly an aspect of this that has really driven that change.
I really feel working with them, that passion for them wanting to do great work with their students, and wanting to support their teams and galvanizing each other. So there's something about the kind of the rigor of wanting to do a better job and wanting to improve, and that
Yes,
vision for that movement towards those things that I think really underpins this work and
yes.
helps people kind of connect with it and then start to put into practice some of the training and the activities that we've been speaking about. So it's been a great experience for me working with them. There's been a lot of passion and enthusiasm, and definitely a lot of implementation, which has been great. So let's look at the structure just for people who obviously weren't involved. On the left-hand side, we've got the way that I've kind of formatted the program for you. So I've decided that for any topic that we've worked on, any session that we're going to run, we've used that cycle process that you can see on the left of the screen. Before people have come into training with me, we've done pre-session reading, we've had pre-session reflection questions or video clips to watch, just to stimulate the thinking and to get people focused on the topics before they come into the room with me. We've then had sessions with all the curriculum managers, the heads of area, the directors, the leadership team who are involved in leading learning, and the coaches who work on teaching learning improvement have all
Absolutely.
attended together. And for me, that's been one of the things that's been powerful, is having everybody in the conversation together who would need to be doing the implementation. And in many colleges, I don't get to have that. I'll be honest with you. People don't make people available. Whereas actually, when you do, you get a much more joined up, connected piece of work, which is, I think, what we've seen
Yes.
working
Yeah,
together.
absolutely.
Subsequently to each session, we've had takeaway implementation tasks. So every time we've delivered training, which has been a little bit of theory, a little bit of research, but a lot of practical discussion as well, we've been giving people small things to take away and try, sets of questions, a process of how to have a conversation, maybe an activity to do in a sharing practice session. So people have had things to go away and play with, which in my training experience, I found incredibly useful because they tend to implement something that is very tangible more comfortably than something that is very abstract. The game changer, I think, for me has been watching the follow up in your organization when I haven't been there, because we've been meeting about every sort of 3 months or so to run training sessions with them. But in between, there's been this critical follow up, which we'll speak about on the next slide. And I've seen work from yourself, from the directors, from the heads to really follow through in different operational forums and through different activities to make sure training embeds into practice. And to me, this is an area in many colleges where there is a real problem at the moment. The follow through is weak, actually. Sometimes
I
it's not
agree.
happening at all, or it might be happening from one or two people, but it's just not consistent. Whereas I feel like I've seen this quite rigorous, quite relentless in a positive way implementation and drive into action. And that's what I think has started to make a change for us in how people have worked. I've really been happy to see something happen that I hadn't expected, which is the managers start to visit each other's team meetings, do some observation in different areas, peer visiting, drop-ins in classrooms, resources swaps, sharing practice. That's all just been spawned from really well-focused, relevant conversations that have happened in training and in follow-up that have driven people to want to bother to use their time in that way, which has been fantastic. And then at the end of the process, we've always done, every time we've met again, some reflection, some sharing practice to try and look at what people have taken away and how things are evolving. So the conversation has been organic and really moving session through session. On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got the topics, the kind of areas that we've selected. We could have selected 20,000 things, but we actually chose a few to really focus on. The notion of the learning leader and how you might drive skills and practice in that way. Some of the works around the QUIP, and also about learning walks, which maybe are two of the key pillars of activity that you can actually use as part of this work. We did a lot of work around meetings, team meetings and one-to-one, and we thought about activities, but we also thought about the language skills that people were using in those dialogues so that it's really reflective and creates a lot of ownership. Just comment for us briefly on the kind of impact and benefit of that kind of shape, because that we came up with that together from our
Yeah,
conversations. But what have
absolutely.
you noticed as the benefits of working in that kind of way?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think I'd probably pick up on what you said about the follow up actually,
Yeah,
Joe. So, you know, like you, I think that has been the kind of essential part that's kind of glued all of those sections together, if you
yeah,
like. So
me too.
your training is in a sense the sort of starting point really for
Yeah,
what we then do afterwards. So, for example, the what you've described there as the sort of takeaway or the implementation tasks are what we would typically then use as those follow-ups. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how I guess I've learned to sort of drive change and impact. I'm always looking for opportunities to make sure that actually we're not just consuming training, we're not just sort of turning up on the Friday and away we go
yeah,
and have a great weekend and all that, but actually the following Monday it's on the agenda. So
yeah,
one example of that is I remember a takeaway task that you gave people just to identify three things that they were going to do. I think this was probably after session two, three things that they were going to implement. And so the following Monday, we would revisit that as to
yeah,
what the three things were that people had selected. And then the Monday following that, the first head would then present how they're going to go about that, or if they have already done some of those three things, what they're finding is the sort of outcome and things like that. And again, you know, it was about encouraging dialogue. It's about sharing practice. It's about, but ultimately, I guess it's about that follow up, and then we would
Yes.
continue to do that and things along similar lines um, between one session and the next session. So actually, that's what's created the sort of dynamic, I think, around all of this. I mean, you know, there are lots of other kind of aspects that I could touch on that I think have also been essential. I mean, you know, uh, our quality team have also been part of this
Yeah.
as well. So as well as the teachers and the directors and the heads of curriculum, our quality team have been part, and they've already started to think about what next year is going to look like. You know,
Yes.
so how do we change and adapt um, some of our processes that perhaps weren't as optimized as they might be. So, you know, there's been a huge amount of reflection around some of the things that have popped out of the training, which are already starting to determine, you know, our strategy, if you like, for next year. You know, how are we going to use learning walks? How are we going to ensure that they then do a full circle
Mm.
back into the team meetings rather than it being focused on, you know, an individual, that it's much more focused on a team,
Yes.
and what that's telling us. So yeah, I think you know there's lots of elements of this, but there's also the kind of glue in between that
Yes.
bring all of that together, which I think is what's made it work. Um, yeah,
Strong message there, though, for me about the accountability, about positive accountability, which again is, I
yes,
think, an area of weakness in our
yes,
sector in many settings where I work.
absolutely,
That follow through to make people accountable for driving action, for implementing, and then for sharing. That loop is often really problematic, and it's loose,
it is.
right? So I think
Yes,
that's one of the strengths, I think, of the piece of work that you've done is you've created a positive, accountable loop. You've created that structured autonomy of the meetings that are there that people know they are going to be reporting back into. And that does galvanize people to put focus and do activity and then bring it. So I think that's actually been, in a way, a very simple message, but in fact, a very powerful one
yeah.
for my understanding of the work that you've done. And I think for other people in the sector, potentially to be thinking about. Okay, so let's have a little think about more around the follow up and how you've been doing that. So, what have you seen in terms of the structure and how has the follow up actually been working? What have you seen about that?
Well, where shall I start? I mean, ultimately, it all comes down to that culture, Joe. That desire to want to develop and improve, that opportunity that people have now to make the decisions, to be, you know, they are empowered to make those decisions and to decide how it best works within their curriculum area. But just on a practical basis, um, you know, there is dialogue around teaching and learning. Team meetings are very, very different to how they were. I described how they were a little bit earlier. You know, they are now about the sharing of good things and sometimes not such good things as
Yeah,
well. Um, I sat in a performance board just a couple of weeks ago with one of our curriculum areas that have been, you know, challenging in a sense, and it's remained a requires improvement area for a number of years. And they were talking to me about the way in which the team now are starting to work on. They're doing 3 action research projects
right.
uh, of varying length, some of which are focused on um, diagnostics and how you use them effectively. Others are very quick projects, I suppose. You know, how do you improve attendance, you know, as a team and things like
Mm,
that. Now, that wouldn't have been something that you know would have been happening before this program. That's come about entirely because of the program and the drive
good.
of that team to want to you know really improve the quality of the student experience, which
Yeah.
has been a grade 3 area for, you know, probably I don't know, but probably a good 2, 3, maybe 4 years. So that's made a major difference. And just to take it all the way down to the student, of course, um, what that has meant is that I think we have much more engaged students. We certainly see that in terms of our uh, predicted achievement data, which is considerably improved where it was last year. We see that in terms of our attendance data and things like that, and also the quality of what the students are doing. So,
Mm.
from that point of view, it's kind of worked through the entire organization, really, from myself all the way down to obviously the heads, the teachers, and the students, a whole team kind of approach. So it's a very different culture to how it was 6, 9 months ago.
Great. And that is the thing with a culture piece, I think. When you start to work on all of those different elements, you start to get those moves and those shifts for people, which is just fantastic. I remember noticing with the team quite early on this notion of how team meetings are used and whether there is even a teaching and learning agenda item as standard and what you might do with that. So even just making that change to put that at the top of the list and think about how to do that in a really relevant and engaging way was important. And your
Yes.
comment, I think, about the action research is interesting. And that to get people to innovate, to try new things, to explore, you've got to have confidence. You've got to have the energy to take a risk and to be creative and to really drive yourself to do something differently, which involves effort. And I think
Yes.
middle leadership can do a lot to galvanize teams to do that, but they need to feel the safety and the
Oh,
encouragement. And
absolutely,
that's the culture
absolutely.
piece.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that is very much the case. I mean, I think that um, what's really struck me actually is just how enthusiastic those staff are, to the
Yeah,
extent that, and this is where I think things are then starting to work, to the extent that actually the teams themselves come back and say to the manager, I think we need to do an action research on this, or
great.
I think this is the next thing that we need to look at. So, that's when you've kind of um, uh, not necessarily cracked the nut, but you've certainly gone a long way, where teams themselves are now starting to fulfill that kind of role, if you like. They're
Yeah,
almost, I guess,
yeah,
almost managing the manager, which
yeah.
is great,
Yes.
and that's a delight to see. Because again, it's the example I'm using is in an area that has struggled, and it's struggled hugely around the quality of its teaching and learning. And to some extent, it's struggled around the sort of coherence of its team, if you like.
Yeah.
Lots of different sort of trade areas working in very different ways. Now it's a very coherent team that is, effectively completing that loop where they are actually now coming back and making suggestions and, you
Yes.
know, helping drive the quality improvement plan and things like that.
So you're
Yeah, it's
getting that
great to see.
ownership for improvement happening at the staff level, which
Absolutely,
is,
absolutely.
I think, when you lead learning well at the middle level and the senior level, you're empowering the layer below you in the structure, if you like,
Yes,
to really pick up information off the ground, use their data, use their observation, use their experiences with students to decide together what they need to do to
yeah,
affect useful
yeah,
improvement. But it's creating that energy and that loop around that, I think, that middle leaders can do when you've got that kind of drive happening around it, which is what you seem to have started to create there, which is great.
absolutely.
So, anything else that we want to say about picking up and following up in between the training sessions, which we've already highlighted was a key thing? Anything else there that you'd like to say about this following up skill?
Oh gosh, I mean, um, I've covered certainly some of those elements there. I mean, again, I can't stress that enough, really. And I think you mentioned, Joe, just a moment ago about how that isn't perhaps one of the things that we do
No,
particularly well in the sector.
no,
And so I think it's an incredibly simple thing to do, but it's an incredibly effective thing to do, is to think all the time about what that follow up actually is. And I don't think that we've got it cracked, in that, we've got a lot of opportunities now for that follow up. Um, but I think we need more. We do need to make sure, and as I said earlier, even as recently as yesterday, discussing this with my head of quality, we need more of those sorts of opportunities for us to sort of um, revisit some of those things. So the second bullet point around the critique of the
Yeah.
quality improvement plans, for example, we will have the heads present the finished quality improvement plan in September,
Yeah.
but with other heads there, and that will be an opportunity just to um, follow up on exactly how well that's worked, and obviously how that's then going to inform the next quality improvement plan for the next year. So yeah, I can't stress the follow up enough. I think it's absolutely essential.
Interesting to me to note when we worked on the quality improvement plan and we did reflective dialogue and we had people swapping their improvement plan with a
Yeah,
colleague
yeah,
and using some critique questions, and actually
yeah,
just how much they welcomed another pair of eyes on their quality improvement plan.
absolutely.
And
Yeah,
we were building that kind of rigor of being able to professionally challenge and critique and look at the crispness of the actions and the link between the potential action and the impact
yeah,
that we might be desiring, and really start to be professionally supportive of each other, but in quite a rigorous way. And I feel that the quality improvement plan dialogue, we really need to keep that thread through the year, and stop it being like a solo activity that's held by the manager. Make sure it's
yes,
collaborative between the manager and the team in terms of framing action and driving activity. But also then as at a management level, there's that reflective leadership's activity where we're swapping plans and we're critiquing in that way.
yes. No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that now I suspect that probably the heads will be quite capable of doing that
Yeah.
themselves. I
Yeah.
think that's what's been created here. Uh, because certainly they are doing a lot of other things across curricular areas. So I think the quality improvement plan, when we come to look at them in September, I think will be an essential part of that. But to your point, there is that openness now, there
Yes.
is that
Yes.
willingness now to be open to other suggestions, and to use that as an opportunity to really create much crisper actions in those quality improvement plans. So yeah, I mean it has been a huge change. It's been a huge change.
Can you say a little bit about this notion of the learning walks and the lesson observation and the fact that we spoke a lot about in our session,
Yeah,
trying
yeah,
to shift those so that really they are not as about judgment and assessment, that they are really about reflection and development, and they are springboards into conversations that happen in teams and with individuals subsequently, and they drive action, and then there's loop closing. So kind of where are you with that thinking? Just give us a kind of little sense of that because it's a big, big area to explore.
yeah. No, absolutely. And I guess this is another one of those sort of follow-ups, I suppose, in a sense, because out of that last session, it posed a number of questions, and I'm thinking here predominantly of questions for myself, but also questions for our quality team and our quality processes. If we're serious about leading learning, and we're serious about developing the teaching and learning, and we're serious about the dialogue around teaching and learning, then we also need to make sure that some of those processes are enhancing that and not necessarily working against it. You don't get a culture change
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
if you're doing all of that we've just described, but then you have this sort of process which is more inclined towards being a judgment. So I can't say a huge amount at the moment, because I think it's still very much in the sort of early stages, because we're thinking about, how is this going to change our approach to learning walks and lesson observations next year. But I think it's highly likely that we will adopt a strategy whereby the learning walks are really not necessarily focused on an individual, but they are going to be much more focused on giving us an indication as to how things are developing in terms of the quality teaching learning within a
Mm.
curriculum area. So
Mhm.
I suspect that probably everything that will come out of learning walks and lesson observations will actually flow through into things like the meetings with the team. So
Yes.
actually
Yeah.
we'll use
Good.
it as opportunities to identify some practices that actually could be shared across not only that team but possibly other teams, or um, areas that perhaps we want to focus on in future CPD or something. Is not going to be attached to the individual. It's going to be attached to the curriculum area
Yeah.
uh, as a sort of overview of where we're at and what we now need to do as a curriculum area. Now, of course, there are, that it's an interesting challenge because, of course, as we know, um, that creates a certain vulnerability as well
Yeah.
because you you lesson observations, for example, up until perhaps 4 or 5 years they were graded, and so colleges had a very supposedly anyway a sort of overview of where they were, or we need more good, or too much of our teaching and learning is requires improvement, or whatever. So that's been stripped away, obviously, over the last few years. But now, in a funny sort of way, we're almost stripping back the
Yeah.
very last part of that, where it's still attached to an individual, and it's not, uh, and it stops there. That's the
Yes.
problem with it. It stops there.
Yes.
Whereas what we're trying to do, I think, is we're trying to use all of that information to then determine what's then going to happen in a
Yes.
curriculum area, but out of a curriculum area as well. I mean, I can see a future perhaps where, depending on what comes out of learning walks and lesson observations, that we're using that then to determine our CPD across
Yeah.
college,
Yeah.
or we're swapping curriculum areas around and moving people across teams for development so that actually it's much more bespoke, I suppose, that people actually are seeing new things that maybe they're not seeing in their own curriculum area,
Yeah.
or they're able to share new things.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm sorry that sounds probably slightly vague because I'm
No,
not
no.
entirely sure as to where it's going to end up, but I'm pretty sure that the whole notion of what we currently see as learning walks, which is always a bit of a surprise to me because I think learning walks almost sort of replace lesson observations as that sort of institutional opportunity to see
Yeah.
exactly what grade we were, or whatever. So
Yeah.
it's going to be an interesting journey, I think. But I think that's really important that that's come out of this training. That's given us ideas, which I don't think. Well, I don't think we'd have probably have had otherwise, or possibly been brave enough to have. I don't know.
That's it. It's the point now, I feel like, with your teams, that you're moving quickly, you're innovating confidently, you're braver to take chances, you're collaborating to share thinking and implementation planning really well. So it's a great time to say, does the learning walk process, the lesson observation process, give us what we want as part of this bigger journey of improvement, development, and culture creation, right? So for me, noticing that learning walks could be diagnostic, they could be about sharing innovation, they
Absolutely.
could be about swapping expertise and insight between teams. They can do so much more, to be
Oh,
frank,
absolutely right.
than
Yeah,
they've
yeah,
been used for badly in many settings where I've been working for the last 10 years. So for me, learning walks is the next big exploratory, innovative battleground, if you like, in the sector of
yeah,
trying to see
yeah,
if it can do so much more for us, and how does it look when we recreate it to become something more reflective, more developmental, and much
yeah,
better joined up with the
yeah.
bigger culture of teams and the
No,
organization.
absolutely. I mean, it's funny to me because I remember saying this to you during the last session when I was a head myself a number of years ago. The term learning walk didn't exist.
Hmm.
But what I always did as a head was I would always walk around the department, and I would go into classes and I would
Yeah.
see how students were doing. I'd look at the work that students were making. Um, and that told me or taught me everything I needed to know about, perhaps what we needed to do in terms of investing in our staff, or the training and the development that might be required, or some of the brilliant practices that I was seeing that I was keen to share. And then I suppose all of a sudden, we learning walks turned into this sort of
Yeah.
process where we're sort of measuring and we're weighing, and we're focusing it just solely on an individual. I suppose in a funny sort of way, I'm trying to get back to what I was
Yeah.
doing all of those years ago. That actually it's informing our practice. It's developing our practice. It's enabling people to be reflective of our practice. But as a department, or as a college, or as a faculty, we're not not just on an individual. It's not just a quality assurance measure. It's got to be a lot more than that.
It's trying to create something that's really expansive, I
Yes,
think, instead of something
yes,
that's really reductive. And I feel what
absolutely.
lots of the practice I'm seeing around
I
learning work at
think,
the moment is so reductive, and it's actually
yeah,
giving people a sense of something that isn't accurate to reality. It isn't the solid judgment, if you like, an assessment of what's going on.
no,
It's a
absolutely.
fake piece of data, if you
That you can
like,
do nothing with. You
but you
can't do anything with it. I mean,
precisely,
what are
it
you
goes
going to do with it?
nowhere
No,
almost. It goes nowhere
exactly
in
right.
many settings.
Absolutely right.
Whereas if you take it as this springboard into reflection, conversation, and further action, you
Yes.
suddenly become a really different organization using drop in a really insightful way, I think.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Final comments then about impact so far. And we've touched on some of this. So just pick up for us the things that you particularly feel have been impact so far as we've worked through this process.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna go straight to the bottom because we haven't touched on the students a huge amount in all of this,
Mm,
but ultimately, everything that we've discussed, and I put there in the bullet points, re-engaging staff in teaching and learning, that culture of continuous improvement, the way in which we uh, look at the quality of our teaching and learning, and then seek to improve it. All of those things ultimately come down to, are our students getting a better
yeah.
experience? Are they more engaged with their learning? And whilst achievement rates are a little bit of a blunt tool in some ways, certainly what we've seen this year is actually how much of an impact this is having on our predicted achievement rates, on the way in which our students, I think, feel much more supported. I think that's certainly borne out by improvements in our student surveys and things like that, and
Mm,
also the high grade achievement. Because, going back to your very first question, why did we want to do this? Well, I think that the other problem, I suppose, for us as a college was that our high grade achievement, our added value, if you like, has never been great. It is something we need to focus on. I think it's fair to say. Our students do well. We have, by and large, good achievement rates. We're a good college, but we want to do more than that. And
hmm
so, therefore, all of what we've discussed ultimately feed into, hopefully, a happier team, of course, but also a more engaged sort of student body as well, and students who are getting um, more than just their qualification, that they are actually getting a lot more than that, that we are starting to think, slightly more outside the box in that. Like a lot of colleges, we've probably in the past, we've probably been maybe too focused on achievement rates, getting students through, getting them across the line. Well, we want to do more than that. And to achieve that, all of those other things have been essential. You don't have engaged students if you don't have engaged staff. Staff are the critical part of this, in my view. Engage them in their teaching and learning practice. Um, Engage them in fair processes that are going to help support their development. Um, Engage them in the way their department is developing. You will have a very content student body, and you will have good achievement rates. You will have good high grades. You'll have students who are achieving great destinations. So that it all kind of fits together for me in that sense. So yeah, apologies for going to the bottom bullet
Oh,
point,
that's
but I think
great, though.
that's a really critical one.
So it's all about where you put the focus. And then underneath what you're saying, for me, there's a lot around aspiration and whether you are
Yeah,
aspiring to do a better job for the students, aspiring to develop more for the staff, aspiring to create the culture for improvement. So there's
what a
definitely
great way of putting
that
it.
vision,
Yeah,
isn't there? There's that vision and that aspiring to do better, and how you
aspiring
fit
is
that.
spot on.
It
Yeah,
is that, isn't it? And I feel like in all of the work
yeah,
that you've been doing, I felt that kind of energy coming from the team and from yourself about trying and wanting to go further than where you are. And I know you
yes.
had Ofsted later on in the year. So when we were well into the work, you had the Ofsted inspection. And what kind of, how did you do with that? And what were they saying about what they could see around that culture?
I mean, the inspection was good, and you know, it's always tough,
Yeah,
especially with enhanced inspections. But no, we did incredibly well. I think it's fair to say we were really delighted with the report. It highlighted a lot of good things
right.
that we were doing around, you know, the culture of the organisation, and you know, the effective sort of leadership and happy students and things like that. But you know, I come back to the word you used a moment ago,
Yeah,
aspirational. I mean, I think it actually does state that we are an aspirational college, and I think we
right.
are.
Aha.
But I think we can be a more aspirational
Yes.
college. Um, you know, I think that uh, you know, I guess exist in a sector that is tough. That you know, the needs of our students become ever more complex and to some extent challenging. We you know, we have such a broad range of students that we almost need to be more aspirational
Yeah.
because you know, there are so many more needs, and uh, you know, students expect good quality education because they want opportunities and they deserve opportunities, and you know, if they don't get that good education, they don't get those opportunities. It's really as simple as that for us. So delighted with Ofsted, um, but I think we're on a slightly different journey now as well. I my principal refers to it as the next step, the next 5%. You know,
Yeah.
that next, you know, post Ofsted is not just sort of sit back and you know, wait for the next Ofsted,
Yeah.
but it's actually now given us an opportunity. So we see Ofsted as an opportunity in a funny sort of way, or post Ofsted as an opportunity to really sort of move on into that next sort of phase of our development as a college. So yeah, delighted with it, but delighted it's out the way, Joe, so that we can actually focus
Absolutely.
on some really interesting things that, you know, some of which are not always going to succeed, but we've got that opportunity now to try things and to move things on. So
Excellent. Well, Keith, I really look forward to hearing about the next steps and the next stage and what happens with the next 5%. And thank you very much for sharing all that insight and
pleasure.
experience with us. And I'll see you at the next training session.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Thanks then. Bye.
All right. Bye.